Right now, we're standing on the edge of something humanity has never seen before. Picture this. For the first time since humans started walking upright, we're staring at a moment where one single person, not a country, not a group, not some ancient kingdom, but one individual human being could pile up $1 trillion. Let that sink in for a second. $1 trillion in the hands of one person. And this isn't some far-off fantasy. It's happening right in front of our eyes. Tesla's shareholders just gave the green light to a pay deal that could launch Elon Musk into trillionaire territory. Think about what that actually means. $1 trillion isn't just being super rich. It's not about having fancy cars or massive houses or even a private island. It's way bigger than that. We're talking about more economic muscle than entire nations possess, the kind of power that throughout history only belonged to massive empires that ruled over millions of people. But here's the thing most people completely miss, and this is crucial. This isn't really about Musk himself. It's not about whether he'll make it to $1 trillion, or whether he's earned it or deserves it. Those questions are honestly too small for what we're dealing with here. This is about something much deeper and more dangerous. This is about the very nature of power itself and what it does to human beings and societies. Because right now, in real time, we're watching humanity make a collective choice. We're choosing to build a pathway that lets one person gather up the kind of power that can shape entire civilizations. And when you look back through history, when you dig into philosophy, when you understand how human psychology actually works, you start to realize we need to ask a really uncomfortable question. Should any human being, ever, under any circumstances, be allowed to control $1 trillion? Let's back up and really understand what $1 trillion represents, because most people get this totally wrong. When people think about extreme wealth, they imagine it's just like being rich but cranked up to 11. Like someone who has a really nice mansion, and maybe 10 private jets instead of one. But that completely misses the point of what happens when wealth reaches this scale. $1 trillion stops being about personal luxury. It becomes something entirely different. It transforms into structural control over human civilization itself. Let me paint you a picture. Back in the late 1800s, John D. Rockefeller didn't just have a lot of money sitting in bank accounts. He controlled 90% of all the oil refining that happened in America. 90%. That meant he could literally decide which cities got energy and which ones stayed dark. He determined which industries could operate and which ones had to shut down. He picked which railroads succeeded and which ones went bankrupt. His wealth gave him the power to redraw the economic map of an entire continent. He was reshaping reality itself. Well, think about the British East India Company when it was at the peak of its power. This wasn't just some successful business making good profits. This company governed territories that were bigger than most European empires. It had its own armies, actual armies with soldiers and weapons. It decided tax policy for hundreds of millions of human beings. The line between being a company and being a government had completely vanished. The company was the government. Fast forward to today and look at Amazon. Amazon controls the logistics network that determines how millions of products reach billions of people every single day. The decisions made inside Amazon's headquarters shape which small businesses survive and which ones die. They influence how entire labor markets function. They determine what prices regular people pay for things they need just to live. SpaceX launches more rockets into space than most countries on Earth. Think about that. A private company owned by one person now effectively controls humanity's gateway to space. We've privatized the cosmos. Even way back in ancient Rome, the richest Romans weren't just buying nice villas by the Mediterranean. They controlled the grain supply that fed the entire city. When grain shipments got delayed or held back, people starved. Economic power translated directly into the power of life and death over thousands of people. The ancient Greek thinkers understood how dangerous this was. Plato warned about what happens when human desires have no brakes, no limits. When desire becomes unlimited, he said, It doesn't lead to happiness or satisfaction. It leads to tyranny. First, you become a tyrant over yourself, then you become a tyrant over everyone around you. Aristotle actually gave this condition a specific name. He called it pleonexia, which means the sick desire to have more than your fair share. He didn't see this as ambition or success or achievement. He called it a disease, a corruption of human character that destroys communities from the inside out. So when somebody accumulates wealth at the trillion-dollar level, we're not just talking about the gap between rich and poor. We're not just discussing economic inequality statistics. We're talking about a single human being wielding influence that rivals entire countries, but without elections, without a constitution, without any form of democratic accountability. Nobody voted for this person. Nobody can vote them out. Now let's dig into what actually happens when private wealth climbs to this level. It starts exercising powers that we normally think belong exclusively to governments, but it do. So without any of the checks and balances, without any democratic accountability, without any legal constraints, without any public oversight, think about modern information systems. Google processes over 8.5 billion searches every single day. That means Google effectively controls how humanity accesses knowledge. The algorithms designed inside that company determine what information looks trustworthy, what news stories spread, and which ones disappear, what historical facts seem credible, and which ones seem questionable. That's not a business function anymore. That's controlling how humans understand reality. That's governing human knowledge itself. The architecture of these systems is literally structuring how humanity knows what it knows. Major financial institutions operate with similar levels of power. During the 2008 financial crisis, several banks were declared too big to fail. What does that phrase actually mean? It means their collapse would trigger a global economic catastrophe. At that exact moment, democratic governments no longer had real power over these institutions. The relationship had completely flipped upside down. The banks had become essential infrastructure, which meant they were effectively holding entire democratic societies hostage. If you don't bail us out, everything collapses. The philosopher Thomas Hobbes recognized this exact danger back in the 1600s. He argued that the whole point of government is to concentrate power in one sovereign authority that prevents society from falling apart into chaos and violence. But when private individuals accumulate power that rivals the state itself, that entire social contract breaks down. You end up with competing centers of authority, each one chasing its own vision of what's good, with no mechanism for resolving conflicts except raw force. Friedrich Nietzsche pushed this analysis even further with his concept of the will to power. He observed that power doesn't naturally seek balance or equilibrium. Power seeks expansion. Power wants more power. When it concentrates in human hands without any restraints, it doesn't stop at enough. It transforms into something that operates beyond ordinary moral rules, reshaping the entire world according to its own internal logic. But maybe the most insidious effect, the most poisonous outcome, is psychological. Extreme inequality doesn't just create economic hardship for people at the bottom. It destroys the very possibility of having a shared society at all. When some people live in completely different realities than others, they stop being able to understand each other's lives. The billionaire genuinely cannot comprehend what it feels like to miss a rent payment and face eviction. The worker cannot fathom the kinds of decisions being made in distant boardrooms that will reshape their entire life. The sense of common fate, which is the absolute foundation of any functioning society, simply evaporates into thin air. We fragment into completely separate worlds with experiences that are mutually incomprehensible to each other. Here's the critical point that almost everyone misses. No individual is the villain of this story. They're not evil masterminds plotting world domination. They're simply the inevitable occupants of a position that the system itself creates. The architecture itself builds these concentrations of power. Legal structures that allow unlimited accumulation. Tax systems that let wealth compound forever without limits. Regulatory frameworks that fail to prevent monopoly formation. The system builds these positions of power, and humans simply fill them. The people inside these positions are just following the logic of the system. Now we need to confront a limitation that nobody talks about. A limit that's baked directly into the structure of the human brain itself. Anthropologists have identified something called the Dunbar number, which is roughly 150 people. That's the maximum number of genuine human relationships our brains can emotionally track and maintain. This isn't because we're selfish or cold-hearted. It's because our neocortex, the thinking part of our brain, literally cannot process the complexity of groups bigger than that. Our capacity for empathy, our sense of responsibility, our ability to understand the consequences of our actions on others, all of that evolved for small communities of people who knew each other. But $1 trillion doesn't affect 150 people. It affects billions. It shapes entire economies, whole industries, multiple governments, healthcare systems, entire populations spread across the globe. And when the scale gets that enormous, something really strange happens inside the human mind. Psychologists have a name for this phenomenon. They call it psychic numbing. As the numbers get larger and larger, our empathy doesn't scale up to match. Instead, it collapses. It shuts down. One suffering child breaks our heart into pieces. We'll do anything to help. But 1,000 suffering children barely registers emotionally. 1 million becomes an abstraction we can't really feel. 1 billion becomes just a statistic on a page. At that point, we stop feeling anything at all and start calculating. We go into spreadsheet mode. And this is exactly the mental state where ethical disasters happen. Not because the person making decisions is evil, but because the human brain simply cannot hold the moral weight of consequences that affect billions of people. People stop being people with lives and dreams and families. They turn into numbers, variables, metrics on a dashboard. We've seen this play out in the real world over and over. There have been multiple cases where billionaire-funded health projects, despite genuinely good intentions, were executed with such terrible oversight and such weak ethical safeguards that they ended up violating people's consent, destroying trust in communities, and actually putting vulnerable populations at risk, not because the billionaire wanted to cause harm, but because the scale itself creates a kind of moral distance. You're so far removed from the actual human consequences that you can't feel them anymore. This is what happens with billionaire-scale projects. When money gets deployed so massively and so impersonally that it no longer connects to the real breathing human lives, it's touching. Think about how decisions actually get made in these massive systems. Someone sitting in a corporate headquarters looks at their computer screen and sees a red number labeled operational cost. They click a button, some algorithm runs, the number turns green, the company's market value goes up, the person who made that decision gets a bonus and a promotion. Everyone celebrates. But what they cannot see, what the entire system is designed to hide from them, is the chain of human consequences that flows from that one click. The worker who loses their job and has to tell their kid they can't afford the birthday party anymore. The small business that collapses because all its customers disappeared overnight. The marriages that crack and fracture under sudden financial stress. The children whose entire futures get reshaped by events they never chose and don't understand. All of that human suffering, all of those broken dreams and shattered plans, get compressed into a single line on a spreadsheet. This isn't a character flaw in the person making the decision. It's a structural flaw in how the system is designed. The philosopher Emmanuel Kant warned that treating people as means to an end rather than as ends in themselves is fundamentally unethical. It violates the basic dignity of human beings. But when decisions operate at trillion-dollar scale, millions of people automatically become means to an outcome. There's no way around it. The structure forces it to happen. And that's the deeply uncomfortable truth we need to face. Human brain biology never evolved to handle trillion-scale moral responsibility. Our brains were built to handle villages, not entire civilizations. We were designed by evolution to care deeply about 150 people we know personally, not 5 billion strangers we'll never meet. So when you give one person enough wealth to influence the entire planet, You're asking their brain to do something it is biologically incapable of doing. No evil intent required, no malice necessary, just the raw limits of human brain architecture hitting a wall. When we look at how civilizations have collapsed throughout history, a consistent pattern emerges again and again. Societies break down when private power overwhelms public institutions. Take the Roman Empire as a perfect example. Most people think Rome fell because barbarian tribes invaded and conquered it. But that's just the symptom, not the actual cause. By the time the late empire rolled around, the wealthiest Romans controlled absolutely massive agricultural estates worked by slaves. These rich Romans paid almost no taxes. They maintained their own private armies. They controlled regional food supplies for entire provinces. Meanwhile, the actual Roman state kept getting weaker and weaker. It couldn't maintain the roads anymore. It couldn't pay the legions of soldiers that defended the borders. It couldn't provide basic security for regular citizens. So when the barbarians finally showed up at the gates, they didn't conquer some mighty empire. They basically walked into a power vacuum that had been created by centuries of wealth concentrating in fewer and fewer hands. The empire had already hollowed itself out from the inside. The external invasion just knocked over a structure that was already crumbling. This exact pattern repeats itself across different civilizations and different time periods. America's Gilded Age in the late 1800s offers a more recent example that's easier to understand. The monopoly structures like Standard Oil, Carnegie Steel, and J.P. Morgan's financial empire controlled more actual wealth than the entire federal government. These men owned senators outright. They wrote the legislation themselves. They deployed private security forces that were basically armies to crush workers who went on strike. Democratic institutions became empty shells, just a facade. The real governance, the real decisions about how society would function, happened in private negotiations between these industrial titans. It took decades of progressive reform, massive antitrust action, and serious social unrest bordering on revolution to restore anything resembling functional democracy. The system had to be torn down and rebuilt almost from scratch. But at least that historical episode proved that democratic systems can be recovered if societies act decisively before the fracture becomes permanent and irreversible. Modern psychological research reveals exactly why this pattern is so consistent across different societies and time periods. Studies conducted by psychologists at UC Berkeley found something shocking. As people accumulate more and more wealth, their capacity for empathy actually declines. It goes down, not up. People from lower economic backgrounds were significantly better at reading other people's emotions and understanding what others were feeling. The mechanism appears to be environmental and situational. People navigating vulnerable circumstances develop better skills at reading others and cooperating because their survival depends on it. Wealthier people have less need to depend on other people for anything, which allows them to focus increasingly on themselves and their own concerns. Over time, their compassion and empathy decrease while their sense of entitlement and self-interest rise. This isn't a moral failing or a character defect. It's a documented psychological effect of the position itself. When elites become neurologically less capable of understanding how different people actually live, the empathy gap that enables systemic neglect becomes structurally inevitable. It has to happen. Even Karl Marx, and we can set aside his broader ideology and political program for a moment, identified something genuinely crucial. Extreme wealth concentration creates objective conflicts of interest that eventually become impossible to reconcile peacefully through normal political processes. When one group controls resources that everyone else needs just to survive, but that group has interests that are fundamentally misaligned with the majority of the population, social fracture becomes structurally inevitable. The system will break. It's not a question of if, but when. The lesson here isn't that wealthy people are villains, or that markets are inherently evil and destructive. The lesson is that every single civilization that allowed private power to grow comparable to public authority eventually experience systemic breakdown, not some of them, not most of them, every single one. This isn't a political opinion or an ideological stance. It's a historical pattern documented across thousands of years in every continent. So what makes us think our civilization is somehow magically exempt from this pattern? What makes us so special? The standard defense of extreme wealth goes like this. Concentrated capital drives innovation forward. It creates jobs for millions of people. It generates prosperity that eventually benefits everyone through market mechanisms and trickle-down effects. But this defense is operating at completely the wrong level of analysis. It's answering a different question than the one we're actually asking. At trillion-dollar scale, we've moved way beyond questions of economic efficiency or market optimization. We're now firmly in the domain of political philosophy and questions about power. The real question is this: who gets to make civilizational decisions that affect billions of people who have absolutely no voice in the process? Consider internet infrastructure as a concrete example. A tiny handful of corporate entities now control the digital backbone of all human communication. The systems they build determine what speech is allowable and what gets censored. They determine what information is accessible and what gets buried. They determine what communities conform and which ones get banned. These are not business decisions about product features. These are constitutional questions about fundamental human rights, like free speech and free association. Yet these decisions are made by corporate structures that are accountable only to shareholders, optimizing for metrics that have absolutely nothing to do with democratic values or human flourishing or justice. Or think about climate policy, which affects every human being on the planet. Fossil fuel corporations possess detailed internal research showing the reality of global warming decades before the general public knew about it. The corporate systems that governed those companies made a choice. They chose to fund massive disinformation campaigns that deliberately delayed action on climate change. Those choices, made purely to protect artillery returns and stock prices, have now committed humanity to centuries of climate instability. Hundreds of millions of people will face displacement from their homes, food insecurity, and violent conflict because of decisions made by corporate structures optimizing for short-term profit. Nobody voted for this outcome. Nobody consented to this future. The architecture of the attention economy itself, optimized for the singular metric of user engagement, has made decisions affecting the mental health of billions of people, especially young people. The humans sitting in the boardrooms weren't evil. They were just doing their jobs, following the logic of the system. Maximize time on platform. Maximize advertising revenue. The result has been measurable increases in anxiety, depression, social fragmentation, and even suicide rates, especially among teenagers. The system was designed to produce these outcomes. The individuals just implemented the design. Montesquieu, the Enlightenment philosopher who heavily influenced America's founding fathers, argued that the separation of powers was absolutely essential to prevent despotism and tyranny. When executive power, legislative power, and judicial power all concentrate in one place, tyranny becomes inevitable, even if the ruler has good intentions and wants to do right. His insight wasn't about bad people or corrupt leaders. It was about dangerous structures that corrupt even good people. We've carefully applied this wisdom to government. We've built elaborate systems of checks and balances. But we've completely ignored this principle in the economic sphere. We've let economic power concentrate without any equivalent safeguards. Modern political philosophy recognizes that legitimacy requires the consent of the governed. When people are subject to power they didn't choose and can't check or remove, that power lacks legitimacy, by definition. Democratic theory isn't just about voting every few years. It's about the fundamental principle that people should have meaningful input into decisions that affect their lives. But trillion-scale wealth creates exactly the kind of unaccountable authority that democracy was specifically designed to prevent, except it's even harder to resist because it operates through market mechanisms that seem natural. It exists across multiple jurisdictions, so no single government can control it, and it claims to be merely economic rather than political, so it flies under the radar. The moral crisis we're facing isn't that individuals are selfish or greedy. The crisis is that even perfectly benevolent systems wielding this kind of power would still be making choices that affect billions of people who never consented to their authority, and have absolutely no recourse if they disagree with those choices. This structural reality crashes head-on into our neurological limits as human beings. No human mind can hold the moral weight of billions of people. The structure itself violates the basic principles that make governance legitimate. So what do we actually do about this? What's the solution? The conventional response focuses entirely on individual behavior and character. We celebrate philanthropic initiatives when billionaires give money away. We criticize greed when they don't. We hope for ethical leadership and responsible stewardship. We try to shame bad actors and praise good ones. But this entire approach misses the fundamental point. The danger isn't who becomes a trillionaire or what kind of person they are. The danger is that our system creates this position at all. Imagine we could somehow replace every current position of extreme wealth with someone of absolutely perfect moral character, someone wise, deeply compassionate, genuinely humble, and committed to helping others. The structural problem would remain completely unchanged, because power at this scale exceeds human comprehension capacity regardless of character. Even perfect people cannot make trillion-scale decisions ethically when those decisions necessarily affect millions of people who have no input into the process. What we desperately need isn't better occupants of these positions of power. We need to completely redesign the architecture that creates these positions in the first place. This means reinventing and updating the structural limits that past societies successfully used to constrain concentrated power. Progressive taxation systems that prevent wealth from compounding indefinitely across generations. Aggressive antitrust enforcement that prevents single entities from dominating infrastructure that everyone depends on. Strong labor organization that gives workers countervailing power to balance corporate power. Real campaign finance reform that prevents wealth from translating directly into political authority and the ability to buy elections. And genuine international cooperation that prevents capital from simply relocating to whichever jurisdiction has the most permissive rules. Now, someone might argue that putting these kinds of limits in place would stifle the innovation we desperately need to solve major problems. But this argument confuses size with creativity. It assumes that bigger automatically means more innovative. Historical analysis actually shows the opposite. True breakthrough innovation often comes from scrappy disruptive startups and university research institutions, not from monopolistic giants defending their existing market position. The goal of antitrust enforcement isn't to punish success or achievement. It's to ensure the market remains a level playing field for new ideas, rather than a walled garden controlled by incumbents who see their power to crush competition. When Standard Oil got broken up, it didn't destroy the oil industry. It actually unleashed decades of innovation and competition. When a TNT got dissolved, it didn't end telecommunications. It directly enabled the digital revolution and the internet as we know it. Think of it like nuclear weapons, which is actually a useful analogy. We don't try to ensure that only good people have nuclear weapons. We don't run background checks and personality tests and hope the right people end up with the launch codes. We build verification systems, international treaties, and institutional checks and balances. We recognize that the weapon itself is the fundamental danger, not just who happens to be holding it at any given moment. Just as the International Atomic Energy Agency monitors nuclear materials around the world to prevent catastrophic concentration of destructive power, we might need similar international bodies to monitor and regulate private concentrations of economic power that have global consequences, particularly in sensitive domains like digital infrastructure, artificial intelligence development, genetic engineering, and access to space. The people who currently occupy positions of extreme wealth aren't the enemy in this analysis. They're not monsters. They're operating rationally and often quite brilliantly within a system that permits and actively rewards unlimited accumulation. The problem is the system architecture itself, not the individuals who are navigating it successfully and winning the game according to the current rules. What we're really debating here is the political architecture of the future, and what kind of world we want to live in. Do we want a world where democratic institutions, as messy and imperfect as they are, hold ultimate authority over major decisions? Or do we want a world where private wealth accumulated by individuals holds that authority instead? Because the historical evidence strongly suggests we cannot have both at trillion-dollar scales. They're fundamentally incompatible. The choice we're facing isn't between capitalism and socialism or between markets and central planning. That's a false framing. The real choice is between democratic capitalism with meaningful constraints on power concentration versus oligarchic capitalism where wealth becomes self-perpetuating political authority that passes between generations. We've actually made this exact choice before, during the Progressive Era in the early 1900s, and again during the New Deal in the 1930s. Both times, American society looked at extreme concentrations of private power and said, no, this is too dangerous. We need to rebalance this. And we did. We broke up monopolies. We created regulatory agencies. We strengthened labor unions. We implemented progressive taxation. And it worked. It created decades of broadly shared prosperity. Now we're being asked to make this choice again, but under radically new technological conditions that make concentrated power even more potent and harder to check. $1 trillion isn't a personal achievement to be celebrated. It's not a trophy or a high score. It's a philosophical problem embedded deep in our institutional architecture that demands a solution. Throughout all of human history, whenever power has concentrated in single positions, whether those positions were called monarch, emperor, oligarch, or chief executive officer, the pattern has been remarkably consistent across cultures and time periods. Societies break and fracture, not because the people holding power were uniquely evil or had bad intentions, but because unchecked authority inevitably loses touch with the needs and lived reality of the people it affects. It's structurally inevitable. We're now rapidly approaching this threshold again, but this time with technology that makes concentrated power more influential and far-reaching than anything previous generations could have imagined. The decisions made by trillion-scale structures operating today will shape human civilization for centuries into the future. They'll determine our information environment, what we know about reality. They'll determine our climate and whether our planet remains habitable. They'll determine our technological trajectory and what kind of future we build. They'll determine our economic foundations and who gets to thrive versus merely survive. So here's the question we desperately need to ask ourselves. And we need to ask it not as some rhetorical exercise or philosophical thought experiment, but as a genuine civilizational choice with real stakes. Should any system of power, no matter how innovative it is, no matter how efficient it appears, no matter how well-intentioned the people running it might be, should any such system be allowed to concentrate this much influence over the future of our entire species in a form that operates beyond democratic accountability, beyond public oversight, beyond the consent of the governed? Because once someone crosses that trillion-dollar threshold, once that barrier is broken, we're not just passively accepting economic inequality as an unfortunate side effect of capitalism. We're actively accepting a fundamentally new form of concentrated authority that dresses itself up in corporate structure and market language, but functionally operates very similarly to the kinds of unaccountable power that humanity spent literal centuries learning to constrain through blood and revolution. History keeps teaching us the same lesson over and over in different forms and different contexts. The architecture matters far more than the individual. Occupying positions within that architecture. Power at this scale doesn't corrupt primarily through moral failing or bad character. It corrupts through structural impossibility. The human brain cannot handle it. Democratic legitimacy cannot survive it. Social cohesion cannot withstand it. The question facing us right now is whether we're willing to redesign the architecture before it's too late, before the concentration becomes so extreme that peaceful reform is no longer possible.